Hello, I'm Rob Doherty and this is the FTSVS podcast, Executive Edition, supported by Liberary Consulting and hosted by Julian Scott, animation consultant for Film London. In this series we'll be chatting to the big hitters in the animation industry and discovering a little bit more about what they do, how they got there, their thoughts on the animation industry, and, I hope, get to meet the person behind that executive title. On the podcast today is Julian's longtime friend Nancy Kanter. Once of Disney and Netflix and now running her own production company, Available Light Productions, Nancy and Julian discuss their friendship, question Nancy's sanity, name drop shamelessly, and look at an incredible career that has played a huge part in how we have watched kids' TV for the past few decades. This is a wonderful and uplifting chat between two old friends. Please enjoy.
Over the years, Nancy has held very senior positions at Disney and Netflix, and more of that later. Most recently, she went completely insane and launched her own production company, Available Light Productions. Nancy, welcome to the FTSVS podcast. Are you insane?
I definitely think I am sometimes, but nice to be here. Great to see you. Lovely to talk to all the FTSVS podcast listeners.
Great. Really lovely to have you here. Now, as a long-standing friend, I think I'm allowed to say you have had the most incredible career.
Aww.
I mean, obviously, we met at Sesame Workshop all those years ago. Since then, you created the Disney Junior channel. You ran it alongside the main Disney channel. You launched series like Phineas and Ferb, Doc McStuffins, and then you went on to an overall deal at Netflix. But you started in quite a different place as a film editor, working with the likes of Jonathan Demme, Catherine Bigelow, Arthur Penn, and Sidney Lumet. How did you get there?
Oh, gosh, how much time do we have? But
as long as you need.
Yeah, I started literally as an apprentice intern on a film that Arthur Penn was directing in my senior year in college, and was lucky enough to be part of the editing crew. The lead editor was Dee Dee Allen, who's sort of a legend in the film editing world. She edited Bonnie and Clyde and Reds and just many, many films. And that was my intention, was to be an editor. I thought that was the part of the filmmaking process I was most curious about and thought I could enjoy. And my brain sort of works really well when I have a lot of pieces and like, how do you put these pieces together? And, you know, I was on that film my entire senior year in college as an intern, unpaid, and did all sorts of, listening and watching and observing and absorbing. And then they offered to bring me into the union, which is sort of unheard of. Nobody gets that chance that quickly. And I went from film to film with Dee Dee and then with other editors until I reached a point where I thought, I'm not quite sure that I actually have the mindset that most editors have, which is they are willing to just keep trying and picking things apart and putting them back together in a million different ways. And I realized, no, I have my idea of how this scene should be cut, and that's the way I want to do it. And it was like, when I found myself as a director would come in and say, well, could we try it? And maybe, let's look at the long shot instead of the close up, or maybe switch. I would sort of look at my assistant and said, you do it. I don't want to do it. So I decided to move into producing because I would have a little more control, obviously. And I was also interested in developing my own stories and finding stories that I, could influence right from the beginning. And spent a few years doing that, having lots of development deals and lots of development time in that typical Hollywood development hell that everybody talks about, where you have a lot of lunches, but nothing ever actually gets made. And then I just completely out of the blue, I did wind up making a TV film for ABC, the ABC channel in America. And then had a friend at Sesame Street who said, well, would you like to come here and make some films for us, short things? And I thought, I had 2 kids at that point. And I said, yeah, that sounds like fun. And that led to them hiring me to become an EP for the series and the show. And I made 42 Sesame Street specials, 32 Sesame Street specials for them. moved to Los Angeles.
Because you weren't from Los. You're a New Yorker originally, aren't you?
Yeah, that's where I'm from, and that's where my career started, and where I thought it would end, but it it didn't. So moved here in part for not so much for me, but for my husband at the time for his work, and realized, gee, like I was still working for Sesame and commuting back and forth for about 2 years every other week, which was really impossible with now 3 young kids, and decided, gee, I better find a job that's here in California because this is kind of hard to maintain. And wound up very accidentally through a good friend of mine when I was thinking, like, what am I going to do? I don't really know anybody here in LA because everything was back in New York. And she said, well, I have this friend and he knows everybody in the kids business. You should, just go in and meet him and, just tell him who you are. And that turned out to be Rich Ross, who was the head of Disney Channel. And I did a very stupid thing. I got there, and people who know me, know that I was never a Disney fan myself. My kids didn't ever want to go to Disneyland. I'd never been to Disney World. I wasn't particularly familiar with Disney films. And so when I got to meet with Rich, he said to me, well, what do you think about a job here? And I said, I don't know. What do you do here?
Great interview technique. Brilliant.
It's probably not the best way to, set yourself up for success in a job interview. And I didn't think of it as an interview. I thought we were just going to have this kind of casual conversation because my friend Judy had introduced us. And he said, well, you should go home and look at the channel because we need somebody who knows something about preschool. And you work at Sesame Street, so you must know something about preschool. And that was really literally the way my career started at Disney. I thought I would last maybe 6 months because I'd never been a network executive. I'd been an editor and then an independent, a freelance producer, and then even at Sesame, I wasn't part of their staff. I was a freelance producer for them. And I thought, well, they'll just figure out I don't know anything about anything and they'll fire me, but I'll take a chance. And, almost 20 years later, there I was.
Because you rose to executive vice president at Disney, didn't you?
I did, yes.
And you had, I think, looking back at what you did, I genuinely think you had an almost unique ability to combine really, really engaging IP with social responsibility and awareness. You did stuff that tackled areas like ethnic and cultural identity, LGBTQ acceptance, epilepsy, anxiety, gun safety, children's health, and yet you managed to deliver to Disney over $2 billion in revenue. You clearly found the Holy Grail whilst you were there, didn't you?
Yeah, I'm obviously very, very proud of what we did. And, I'm always drawn to story and character first. So it wasn't as if I set out to say, look, I'm going to make shows about these very important and very relevant things in kids' lives. I have to fall in love with the story. I have to feel that the characters have an emotional quality that is really going to endear them to kids, and they're going to want to come back and watch these stories over and over again. And then you sort of think about so what's meaningful to kids, and what are some of the things that are in their lives, and what are the issues of the day that you can address in a really responsible way, because kids get so much of their information from the media that they consume, and that can make an impact. And so if we can do a story that allows, especially on a platform like Disney, where, typically you would stay away from anything that was too topical or too controversial. But if we can find that right way to a story that reinforces, some of the ideas that, families come in all different sizes and shapes. People come in all different colors and sizes. There are issues around whether it's gun safety or anxiety that kids are wrestling with each and every day. How do you build that into a story that doesn't just become a soapbox for those issues, but really hits home and hits hard in a way that I think is really meaningful? And I was lucky enough to be able to get the opportunity to do that. I had to make sure that we did it in a way that, again, put story and character first, But, I had the support to not shy away from some of those. And sometimes it was hard. There were hard conversations like, is a show with two moms appropriate for a preschooler? Is, somebody saying I'm gay for really the very first time, as we did with Andy Mack on Disney Channel on a Disney branded platform, is that going too far? And so there were honest conversations, and thankfully, I was able to sort of gather the support and the awareness and the understanding from the absolute top decision makers that these were themes that Disney could absolutely address, and that it was doing a great service to the audience that we had.
No, and I think it's very interesting because again, I mean, when I was re-looking at your resume, I mean, you do mention the sort of the financial side of things as well, because you were a very, very successful, and still are a very, very successful executive who has managed to marry commercial success with strong story and interesting topics and stuff like that. And it's interesting that you also said you actually had real support from the sort of the upper echelons of Disney to do that. Did you? I'm presuming you use sort of developmental psychologists and people like that to ensure that you were making sure that you were telling those stories in an age-appropriate way?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Anytime. I mean, on the preschool side, we had an in-house group of educational consultants and child development experts. I had built that team. We had often gone out to individual vendors as we were developing each show, and we would hire both curriculum advisors as well as people who would do sort of in focus group testing for each and every episode to make sure that we were really communicating it well and clearly, and there was the appeal. And after a while, I thought, this is kind of silly. We're not taking advantage of this information, this stockpiling of information that we're gathering from each and every testing session. If we brought that all in-house with educational experts and curriculum advisors and development, we could kind of use that and build upon that knowledge for each and every next show. So we built an in-house team of that. And then and that was for preschool. And we, every episode was tested, sometimes multiple times. On the older kids side, the live action side and the older animation side, we didn't use that group particularly. We kept it more, they were so busy, frankly, with preschool. Mm-hmm. But when we had a story that was attacking a theme that we thought, we really need to know how to talk about anxiety with kids, how to talk about gun safety, how to talk about, gender identity, we would always go out to a team of experts to inform us before we even started writing it. And then as we went through drafts of the script and even in performance to make sure that we were being as responsible and as possible.
And I think it just goes to show that those, for want of a better phrase, edgier storylines are really, really important to the audience. And,
sure.
These days, I still think there's a little bit of pushback, and I'm talking more about the UK than obviously the US. But back in the day, we used to have some sort of kids soap operas, really, which used to tackle some really, really interesting and important topics through the eyes of children of that age. And I do wonder sometimes if there's a bit of a gap now between what we're delivering as media to that audience and the reality of their life. And you think of what's going on social media and all sorts of other things. And there seems to be a reluctance to get involved with that now and say, this is what's happening, and this is what you need to know about it, and these are the guidelines, and this is what you need to be aware of, and this, that, and the other. Do you think that's the case generally? Do you think people have got more nervous about those topics?
Yes, to a certain extent. I think what's happened is where the gap is that there are certainly those properties, those like Euphoria, which sort of, they are talking about teenagers, and sometimes even, preteens, but they're so extreme. And I don't think you would find it very comfortable as a parent to have your 10, 11, 12-year-old watching some of those programs because of how, graphic they are. So I think where the gap is finding those properties that are sort of made for that audience that is sort of done with preschool, isn't really ready for true teenage, properties that are really sort of pushing the edge. And so how do you find stories that do inform and do sort of give a true lens on what's happening? Because, it's true that 10 and 11 and 12-year-olds are watching things like Stranger Things. They're watching, The Walking Dead, so they're exposed to, this very adult content. And where I think we're not necessarily providing is something that feels a bit more age appropriate for that sort of 7, 8 plus, until you get to sort of like that 15 or 16-year-old, when they're really in the thick of, sort of what's happening in terms of social interaction and social media. And then and again, you have just this more almost adult type fare for them. And I think that there is just this gap where people just don't know how to necessarily create the content that they think will bring that 6 to 11, 6 to 14 audience in part because I think YouTube and TikTok and Roblox and video games have taken up so much of that age group's viewing that it's really hard to bring them to something that isn't as that feels a little softer, or feels like, oh, I don't necessarily need to watch that.
Sure. And I'm thinking, sort of slipping back into animation, do you think animation can have a significant role with that age group, with those topics? Do you think animation is a sort of a suitable platform or suitable device for delivering that story?
Absolutely. I mean, I remember back when I was at Disney, we did Owl House, which absolutely addressed some of those issues. Again, it was in a fantasy world, but that was a series that was definitely made for that 6+ audience. And it addressed, gender identity and all of that. And we got tremendous amount of response from the audience to say, oh, I'm so glad to be seeing these characters. I have a girlfriend too, or, I'm thinking about who am I really attracted to. Yeah, I think animation absolutely can address that, and sometimes in an even easier way for that audience to digest, because it feels slightly removed from reality, right? Because it's drawn, and you can give them a little bit of perspective and distance from it, but as I said, absolutely, I think all of those issues. We've dealt with anxiety in animation. And even in preschool, we had an episode of Doc McStuffins where we didn't make a big deal out of it, but we had an episode where one of the characters had 2 moms, and we got, again, just tremendous, in that case, negative and positive response, where you had, people who were, oh, thank goodness, this represents my family at last. My daughter, my son can see a family that looks like ours. And then you have to be prepared that that's going to not be pleasant for other people, and they're going to come back and say, why are you showing that? You shouldn't be teaching kids that kind of thing.
It's interesting how they, that phrase, you shouldn't be teaching them this, and you're not teaching them this, you're just exposing them to something slightly different.
Yeah, exactly.
And when you were looking at the projects, when you were at Disney for all that time, what were the 3 key things that you were looking for in a pitch that you thought, oh, maybe this is for me?
Well, I can tell you the things that I would tell people don't do.
Okay, fair enough. Do that.
No, don't bring musical instruments to a pitch. I would think would be one.
Okay. I'm going to make some notes just in case I decide to pitch it. So,
exactly.
No musical instruments, right?
Don't bring musical instruments. I've had somebody, bring so many different things, including a set of bongos, which I thought, like, oh God. But for me, I wanted, in some ways, to be surprised. I wanted to hear an idea that I could sort of say, why didn't I think about that? Those always were the ideas that grabbed me, and in fact, often led to the biggest success for us, because it felt like it was going to be new, it was going to be fresh, it was going to be um, something that we could really build a story and character around. So for me, that was always, if I felt like I've heard this idea 50 times in various small iterations, for me that was just a sort of big red flag, which is, is there really going to be enough here? And then I looked at, who are these characters? Why do we think kids are going to fall in love with them? And how will we make kids fall in love with them by virtue of the stories that they're going to tell? And that always was finding that emotional connection that a kid would make to the characters. And even if it was a more action-oriented show, it could be, it could be more of a superhero show. When we were developing Spidey and his amazing friends in preschool, we knew the impact that Spider-Man had on 3 and 4-year-olds. I have a 4-year-old grandson now, and he's obsessed with Spider-Man. I don't know. It's sort of like there's some gene in little boys' brains that just fires up at around 3 or 4 years old. But, it's not just that he's he's a character in a suit with webs. It's also, I think what draws you to those characters is who they are as children, who they are as people, what is their character, how do they bring themselves to the story, not just the superhero aspect of it. And I looked for that, first and foremost in everything that was pitched, which was, if it felt too superficial, I just thought, gee, I'm not sure this is going to, survive. I know you asked me for 3 things. The other thing was really, especially in animation, because it's such a collaborative process and it takes so long, it's you don't just go on, write a script and go out and shoot it and edit it and it's done. I really had to feel like I wanted to partner with these people and be willing to sort of get on the phone and talk things through for 3, 4, 5 years. And if I felt like, I don't know if this is going to be a great partnership, that was also just a warning sign for me. And that didn't mean we had to become close, friends, but I needed to know that we could have a real dialogue and a real honest, open communication. And I wanted to hear their ideas and they wanted to hear mine, and that we could have that trust in each other. I felt building the trust, especially as an executive where, creatives, writers, directors, producers, there's always a bit of, it's the executive's notes, here it comes, And for me, it was really important to build that trust and that feeling that I was working to help you make the best show you could make.
Yeah, so you wanted to work with people who, I suppose, to an extent, respected your input, welcomed your input, and maybe pushed back sometimes if they didn't agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. It is that dialogue. It is that push back and forth that I think pushes things to be better. And in my experience, in the best of those situations, the creators recognize that as well. It's like, we don't agree about everything. Sometimes I give in, sometimes you give in. But on the whole, if there is that trust between you, I am trying to help you make the best show, and I know you're trying to make the best show. I really believe that. Nobody goes into this to make a mediocre show. We all believe we're going to make the best thing ever.
No, of course. It's interesting you're talking about that collaboration and back and forth. I did actually at one point have a contract from somebody where there was a sort of a dispute resolution procedure, where a creative dispute resolution procedure, where if we didn't come to an agreement on something creatively, we would basically come up with a different way of doing it. And they were trying to put that in the contract, which that was a bit of a red flag to me, to be honest with you, because I thought if we couldn't talk it through,
yeah,
it wasn't going to be good.
No, I totally agree. And, look, there are many examples where I think one of the sort of clearest to me was we were doing a show and the writer, it was a Winnie the Pooh show, and the writer who I loved, and the story editor and writer, and he was a fantastic writer, Brian Hofeld was his name.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to do this episode where Eeyore was just sad. He wasn't angry. Nobody heard him. Nothing happened. And his friends were saying, well, what are you sad about, Eeyore? And he was just saying, I'm just feeling sad. I'm just blue. And Brian, handed in a treatment for the episode. And I said, I don't know, like, I don't think anybody's going to want to stick around just to see, Eeyore moping for 22 minutes. And like, don't we have to at least explain why he's sad? He didn't get invited to the birthday party, or, somebody, took something. And Brian was just adamant. And he said, no, I think kids feel that. I think sometimes they don't know why they're not happy, or they need they need to be on their own. And I just want to explore that. And we went back and forth on it a lot, and finally I respected him. I respected his work. And I said, go, write it. Well, lo and behold, it wound up winning a Humanitas award.
There you go.
and honestly, it was a great moment for me, and a great moment for him, where I could just say, you were right, absolutely. Thank you for pushing, and thank you for sticking to the story that you wanted to tell. And in the end, if it hadn't won an award and it hadn't been the best episode ever, it wouldn't have made a tremendous difference. But it built, again, that trust between us, that I was going to give him that latitude to write what he wanted to write. And it turned out, perfect. So anyway, lesson learned.
That's a great story.
This podcast is made possible thanks to the support of the awesome Liberi Consulting. Liberi offers specially tailored industry-related training courses. Check them out at libericonsulting.com. That's LIBERI consulting.com. You can also find links to their fantastic courses on the Festivus website.
So there you are. You're at Disney. You're doing, great success. You're, shows that you're commissioning and working on are, critical acclaim, obviously doing very well financially. And then Netflix comes sniffing around, and we're offering you an overall in-house production deal, I think. How did that role differ to the one that you had at Disney? And what made you think it was the right time to make that move from Disney to Netflix?
Oh boy, so many things. The true answer is, my contract was coming up, and I was looking ahead at sort of what the landscape was starting to look like at Disney. Now I was beyond just preschool. I was also doing the teen tween side, and also doing things for Disney Plus. And I honestly felt like creatively I was not on the same page with many of the decision makers, mostly, especially around the teen programs, and where it was sort of looking like it was going to be heading. As I said, I'm always interested in doing sort of something new, something fresh. I'm not the person who is ordinarily the one like, let's do a reboot or a sequel to this. And I just really started to feel creatively that I was just sort of not feeling enthusiastic. And I had told myself many times, in many different ways, that when I got to the point where I wasn't really excited and happy to walk into my office every day, it was going to be time for a change. And I just found myself getting closer and closer to that. And so I decided not to renew my contract. And it coincided with the pandemic. I said I would stay for another year, for just a transitional year, as we look to solidify, who would take over and what the roles were. And then the pandemic hit. And so everybody was literally, at home, and who knows what we were doing. And Netflix had heard that I was going to be leaving Disney, and I didn't know that I wanted to. I sort of knew that I didn't want to go into an executive role, because I felt like I had done that for 20 years, and I wanted to be a bit closer on a day-to-day basis to all of the sort of creative decision-making and steps. I was obviously, had responsibility over all that decision-making, but, I said, I'd love to read maybe the first draft of a script instead of the fourth draft of a script. Maybe my notes would be more effective at the first draft than at the fourth, and everybody's rolling their eyes because they're 4 drafts in. So I didn't want to go into another exec role. And Netflix, approached me and said, well, then what about, an overall production deal? And what was very interesting and appealing to me was it didn't have to be limited to either preschool or animation or series, that they said, it was the time when it was come, make everything.
Right.
And it was hard to figure out why to say no when they were, dangling this in front of me and said, you want to make movies? We'll make movies. You want to make live action series? We'll make live action series. You want to make animated films? We'll make animated films. It didn't turn out that way.
Oh dear. Okay.
I will be honest. I think they sort of made the deal for me. I still had 6 months, I think, left on the year that I had promised to Disney, so we had to wait. And by the time I got there, things had really changed
Right.
for many, many reasons, some of which were not hard to foresee, that the finances and the process that had been feeding them for the prior, whatever, 4, 5, 6, 7 years was starting to change as they were reconciling sort of this very expansive slate, very expensive budgeting with what the outcome of that was. So it just became harder and harder to find the path forward. But it was great for me. I got to develop a lot of things, all of which I'm extremely proud of and sort of align with what I talked about before in terms of the kinds of storytelling. It just became, clear, more and more clear that their needs and their appetites and where they saw the lanes were, again, sort of just getting narrower and narrower. So when that deal concluded, I went off into the great cold landscape that we're in right now as an independent producer.
Well, I was going to. Next thing, you sort of answered my next question, really, which was, I was wondering if the seismic shift in where the kids' audience spends their time now, which you alluded to earlier with Roblox and YouTube and things like that, and the downturn in commissioning and investment. I was wondering if if you chose to leave Netflix, but it sounds like it was coming to a natural end anyway, and that was the opportunity to make that crazy move and launch your own production company. And I was just wondering, in doing that, I assume you apply the same rigor as an independent producer out on your own without the sort of the coziness of a production deal at Netflix. You apply the same rigor to selecting the projects you're involved in that you did at Netflix and at Disney.
Yes, honestly, maybe even a little bit more so, because I don't, at Disney, I always had to consider the brand of Disney, which is, does this feel right for Disney? Aside from my own personal, attraction or interest in a material, I recognize, look, there's a Disney brand that is very clear and very obvious and is an expectation of the audience, certainly the adults. And I had to be able to defend the choices, frankly, in big rooms and small, to say, this is why we're going to put Disney on this project, the name Disney. So that, in some ways often would, color the yes or no to it. Netflix was a little bit different because they don't have that kind of brand, but I knew that my success and what they had hired me, my overall deal was to be successsful for them, given the information that they had about how audiences watched their content on that platform. So again, you just sort of keep these things in mind as you're assessing, hey, is this likely to fit the remit that, Netflix has right now? Is this, with their algorithms and their data, they have a lot of insight that they use to guide their creative choices. And they adhere to that quite loyally. And I couldn't ignore those facts. I couldn't, pretend like they didn't have that information and that the decisions were going to be based not using that information. So now that I'm on my own, obviously I'm still looking at the marketplace because I have to sell it. So I could fall in love with it, but if I feel like, gee, there's literally nobody on the earth who's ever going to want to buy this show, is it worth my, my time and investment? But certainly more so, I'm the key things, because otherwise I don't know what value I would bring to something if I'm not, attracted and engaged by it because of the story and the character. It's hard to make, like people bring me horror things all the time, and I think I'm not going to be able to give you a good note because I don't know anything about horror and I don't watch horror. So, um, I always feel like I can be of value to the property. And so then it has to hit me in some way that makes me think that there's a reason for me to get involved with it.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you actually, whether you thought being a buyer for such a long time helps you sell stuff.
I think so. I think because I'm able to, get into that buyer's head, and my mindset, which I know so well, which is it's not always just a purely creative decision. There are often other factors that just have to be taken into account. Sometimes as simple as, gee, we already have a show about this, or a show that sort of overlaps this. That'll impact the decision. And I do think, as we were saying before, part of what the decision-making process from the buyer's perspective is not only do I love this project, but do I want to partner with these people? And so, I try and present myself and the opportunity and the property in such a way that a buyer can say, yeah, I want to be in a room with her for the next 3 years or 4 years. So yeah, I think it gives insight. I think I also having been a producer, and been on the other side, not always on the executive side of the table, also gives me an ability to sort of understand how the creative side works as well, and to give those notes that can be heard, as opposed to those notes that simply like, I don't know what the hell they want,
We've all received a few of those.
For sure, it's like, I don't know, and because I've received those notes, can you make it more purple? What does that mean? Faster and funnier,
And do you want that 15% funnier and 10% faster, or 15% faster and 10% funnier?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's that combo. I think, it is the thing I think that has helped me in my career is having that experience and that ability to say, like, how do we give this note so it's really can be heard and not dismissed? And then also as a buyer to know, like, you know what, if you come in with bongos, chances are they're not going to buy your pitch.
Okay. I'm going to send the bongos I got from Amazon back tomorrow, I think. It's clearly not a good move.
Yeah.
As we're sort of beginning to wind up, I just wanted to ask you a few final questions as look, joking apart, launch yourself into the independent sector. What do you think is the best piece of creative advice you have ever given somebody?
I've ever given somebody. That's a good question. I think it probably was along the lines of what I was talking about before, which is be bold, be willing to take a chance. I feel like, good things that really last, things that stick, things that become that, big hit come because they're surprising, and you have to be willing to take some risks and to, make them calculated risks. Don't come in with something that is so outrageous that it's just never going to fly. But I think listening to yourself and knowing the story that you want to tell and then telling it the best way you possibly can is really important.
Okay. And what business advice would you have given yourself at the start of your career?
Ooh, business advice. I think I would have told myself a little bit of what I just told somebody else, which is, I think in the start of my career, I was not as adventurous in some way, not as willing to take a risk and take some chances as I evolved to be later on in my career. And I wish I had known that there was more to be gained by taking more risks earlier on.
Okay. And finally, right now, I think it's recognized that the business, the animation sector is in a bit of flux. Would you encourage someone to enter the industry right now?
Ooh, that's a tricky question. I have an abiding faith in the fact that stories aren't going anywhere, and that there is always going to be a need and a use for really good stories. I think the animation industry probably in particular is going to change radically. I think you can't ignore what AI will do to the process of animation. I still believe we're going to need artists, and that regardless of how good AI gets, you want that human touch and you want that human innovation. AI is great at, sort of looking at what's been done, but it doesn't create something new. And I think that that's always going to be an absolute essential part of the process. That being said, it's going to be harder and harder, I think, to find work and find jobs. And I think especially at the entry level, where some of those steps and processes that were always done, by a human hand, I think some of those will be taken over by AI. And I think there will be a fundamental change. But that's not to say that if your passion is animation, if your passion is storytelling, I say go with it. Because it will cut through. It has to. It's not all going to be taken over by robots and machines. I truly, truly don't believe that. But just as, cobblers are a rare breed these days, I think there will be some elements to the production process that will sort of change dramatically. But the big ideas, the big stories, the big concepts, the big successes, I think are still going to be driven by those original artists and minds that have always driven that.
Well, there you go. What a fun chat and what an incredible career. Inspiration for us all, I hope. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon for another Festivus podcast, Executive Edition. As always, a massive thanks to Julian Scott for hosting. Information about Film London can be found at filmlondon.org/animation. Well worth a visit. And once again, a huge thank you to Liberry Consulting for all their support in making this podcast series a reality. Check out their industry-related training courses on the Festivus website now. Thanks everyone, and come back soon for more episodes.